You're watching Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Brevi, and it's a pleasure to introduce from Ottawa, Dr. Robert Muggah. He's a co-author of the book that we're talking about, Terra Incognita, 100 Maps to Survive the Next 100 Years. And from Oxford is Professor Ian Goldwin. Thank you so much for giving us your time. I know it's been extremely busy, apart from everything else that you're doing, which is a lot. You're promoting the book as well.
Thanks for the invitation.
Very much.
Professor Goldwin, just if I can get you to explain to our viewers what exactly the book is about. I mean, it's a way of visualizing global trends, isn't it? And there's a mind-boggling use of maps, of infographics. So, but what do you mean by 100 maps to survive the next 100 years?
We live in extremely confusing times. There's so much happening. We need to gain better perspectives. And what we try and do in the book is create, using maps and visualizations, images, satellite images and figures, ways of understanding how we got to where we are today and where we're going. And by better understanding the past, the present, we can better anticipate the future and we can make a better future. So our aim is to help readers empower their lives, to help them make decisions in a time of information overload, in a time of incredibly rapid change, and of course at the moment in a time of COVID. So our hope is that this book will be used as a toolbox. This book will be used as a means to help people have more effective lives, and through that the world condition will also improve.
Dr. Muggah, a picture tells 1,000 words, but when you have maps and data, especially over time, that tells a hell of a lot more. The state we're in, as Professor Goldwin is pointing out, and what we need to do. So is this a guide to kind of change the future for the better by learning from the past and the present?
That's right. I think that's right. I mean, just to echo what Ian had mentioned, we're facing extraordinarily unprecedented, complex, intersecting threats that are, many of them are existential, perhaps more dangerous than at any point in our existence as a species over the last couple of 100,000 years. And so our hope is that by visualizing the mega threats on the horizon, we can build better awareness and more understanding. And that's not just about talking about the present, but also talking a little bit about the past, about the remarkable progress we've made in the last century or so. We're hoping that we don't just illuminate some of the challenges, but also help contribute towards building solutions and people taking action. I think one thing to say is that map making and the use of maps is an ancient idea. Yeah. It's an impulse we've had for thousands and thousands of years. And we've been drawing our whereabouts on cave walls since the dawn of certainly our species. But we've come a long way especially in the last couple of 100 years. And there's an amazing diversity of the kinds of maps that we're seeing today. There are thousands of satellites right now that are circulating our planet that are giving us images right down to almost to the microscopic scale, using all sorts of remote sensing and imagery techniques to understand and take a pulse of our planet. And so the maps that we've got in this book, which were formed by and produced by Carnegie Mellon University's Create Lab, which is a group of robotics and aerospace and AI engineers and others, really were intended through providing and making available thousands of data sets, a better understanding and awareness of our past, present, and hopefully a helpful guide to our future.
Dr. Muggah, when you're talking about awareness, and especially in the current times of pandemic, let's talk about COVID and how you've looked at that. I mean, whether you look at Johns Hopkins the data, or whether you look at the WHO, each country has its own as well. Explain a little bit, and we'll also put out the visuals, the animations, and the graphics that you are using for our viewers as well.
It's pretty remarkable when you think about it, that here we're facing this global pandemic, and we can't see the enemy, the pathogen. We only can intuit it from what professionals tell us, or what doctors tell us, or the symptoms that we see amongst our neighbors, our friends, our relatives. And so when you think about it, the COVID-19 pandemic, like a couple of pandemics before it, has really been profoundly influenced by maps. I mean, think about that red and black display from Johns Hopkins University that was produced by the university, but also with a mapping company called Esri. It's really given all of us, everybody, from India to the UK to Canada, but of course everywhere in between and around, a sense of the progress of the virus, the spread of infections and recoveries and fatalities. And it filled us, with a sense, in a way, of dread at one level and foreboding when you really think about it. And that's important because the colors of maps, the heuristics of maps actually matter and they shape our understanding. But it's not just the Johns Hopkins map that has been, or the World Health Map. There have been thousands of maps and dashboards and visualizations that have been created, including in India, by city administrators and state administrators to give citizens and decision makers a better understanding of what's happening around them. I think one of the things that we can say about COVID-19, apart from generating a better understanding through maps of its ineluctable, inexorable movement around the world, has been the way that it's accelerated and deepened existing trends, including trends like inequality, marginalization, especially amongst the most vulnerable. And these dynamics, I think, are really vividly expressed both spatially, on maps, as well as socioeconomically at the city scale. And what we've seen in big cities, especially in cities like Mumbai or Delhi or Kolkata or Chennai, is that high density, overcrowded, underserviced neighborhoods tend to be much more badly affected by this pathogen, by this epidemic, than those that are not. And people from poor, more informal and minority populations, and this is irrespective of whether it's in India, frankly, or anywhere else in the world, it could be are more infected and in much higher numbers and in much more severe ways than those who are not. And more than that, people who lack digital access, in fact, those people who probably don't see those Johns Hopkins maps, and there's still a good 40% of the world that don't have regular digital access. People who don't work remotely, people who are in lower wage and more marginal positions, or in the informal sector, which makes up 60% of the global economy, of the global GDP, they're also on the front lines. So what we're discovering with these maps is, like so much else in life, one's zip code, one's postcode determines one's destiny. And I think maps show that more profoundly and in more profound ways than we can, than virtually any other means.
Professor Golden, Dr. Muggah is talking about the deepening and the widening of many inequalities that we've been seeing over the ages. Would you say that the pandemic, that the COVID, has also accelerated many things, whether it's technology being used, or especially when it comes to globalization? I want to get your thoughts on that, because there's already been a trend across the world in many big countries as well of coming inwards or looking inwards. Whereas for the pandemic, it should be just the opposite, shouldn't it, Professor?
Yeah, in many ways, some people are saying that COVID-19 has led to deglobalization. I think the opposite is the case. One aspect is the aspect that Rob's been talking about. We are more aware of what's happening elsewhere in the world than ever before. We follow the track of this virus around the world, and clearly that's been hyper-globalized. Not only the virus itself, but the information about it, and now the science and the vaccines. That's a global collaboration. When I speak to my colleagues in Oxford who are working on vaccines, they've never been more globally integrated in terms of the science collaboration, in terms of the information they're receiving, and of course the rollout of the vaccine that's going to be so vital. That's going to have to be hyper-globalized. Other aspects of globalization are also accelerating. What we've seen in this interview we're doing is, of course, digital acceleration. There's never been a more rapid flow across national borders. In fact, digital flows are something like 10 times higher this August and September than they were a year ago. So that's another aspect of globalization that's really accelerating. Another aspect that's going to accelerate is financial flows. 100 countries have applied to the IMF for bailouts. There's going to be massive movements of money around the world to support countries in needs, but also because the center of economic gravity is moving very rapidly to Asia. The US is going down, its economy is contracting, people are seeing opportunities increasingly elsewhere, and that's going to lead to private flows and mergers and acquisitions, as well, of course, as aid flows will also be flowing. The manufacturing of goods, the product manufacturing, which is what people often think about when they think about globalization, supply chains and so on, that was already decelerating before COVID-19. And that's because of automation. It's because of People want individualized products. They want immediate delivery. You don't want it to come in a container 3 weeks later. And it's because of nationalism and protectionism, but of course was there long before COVID-19. This is accentuated. So that is changing, but it was changing anyway. And it's not only in manufacturing of things, it's also in services. Call centers, back offices of financial firms, of legal firms, of consultancies, which went to Bangalore and many other places around the world. That's being automated increasingly. The information is in the cloud. It's not in Bangalore or in Manila and in the other places it went to. And that's going to change the nature of globalization. The one aspect that I think is permanently changed is business travel. I think we're recognizing that their cost efficiencies, their time efficiencies, that we reduce the carbon emissions and help stopping climate change by not traveling as much for business. So that will be permanently reduced. I think tourism travel and personal travel will leap back up as soon as people can. In fact, it'll be at higher levels than before because there's a lot of catch-up that needs to be done on that. So, when you put this all together, say, what aspect of globalization are you talking about? But when you put it together, there's accelerated. The one aspect that worries me most, which we need to accelerate, is political globalization. And that's really the worrying thing, because if this pandemic shows us one thing, it's that we need to coordinate more. We need to empower institutions like the World Health Organization. We need much more political coordination. And the big question mark, which I don't have the answer to, and the book is really talking about, is are we going to get cooperation between countries to stop global threats? And that's what we need more of.
Well, one of the major global threats, pandemic or no pandemic, Dr. Muggah, is climate change, which affects everybody. And there's a lot in your book about that.
Yeah, I mean, just building on Ian's point, it's not just the lack of cooperation, but it's also the systemic nature of how these different threats are coming together. The decline in business travel, which may seem as a dividend for some, is obviously a distress for all the businesses that rely on that and all the ancillary businesses and systems that require that movement, that lubrication of the global system. And the same applies for the rise of the digital economy. I mean, we've seen more digital onboarding in the last 10 months than we've seen in the previous 10 years. And as Ian said, and as the book explains, this is very much a part and parcel of the COVID effect, this acceleration effect. But the digital economy comes with a dark side, and one of them is climate change. Tech firms and the tech industries and the ICTs around it are described as some of the least sustainable and most environmentally damaging sectors in the world. And to meet the voracious demand for hardware, of course, we have to extract commodities, including rare earths. Technology redundancy is contributing to massive amounts of pollution and loading up of plastics. But more worrisome than that, the expansion of the internet services that we use, that we rely on, including this interview, are part and parcel of some of the biggest consumptions of electricity on the planet, right? So about 1/10 of all global electricity production is consumed by internet and digital and related services. And this comes from where? Well, a lot of it comes from coal-fired plants. And so as we're trying to scale up our demand for consuming online, we're also having to scale up our consumption of environmental goods. Just to put this in perspective, one single server room in a data center can use about as much energy as about 180,000 homes in the United States. The mining of Bitcoin uses as much energy as would be required to drive 6.5 million US homes a year. So huge amounts of energy and negative externalities generated by what is essentially a good, which is the digital economy. So I think this interconnected nature of these threats is something that we try to impress upon our readers in the book. But let's talk about the climate front, because I think, when it comes to COVID-19 and climate, there's good and bad news, right? The bad news is that industries and supply chains have been hit extremely hard. And Ian and I have written and talked about the airline industry, which is, one of the worst hit sectors, which has seen a decline of between 40 and 60%, even up to 80% in some countries over the last couple of years. But the good news, the silver lining, is that the carbon footprint of this sector has also shrunk by about 60%. So you can see this from space using maps to track CO2 and NO2 emissions. But that's not all. We've also seen, and you feel this, I think, most acutely in a place like Delhi or Mumbai, is the incredible reduction in traffic. As lockdowns went into effect, weekdays became weekends. Rush hours disappeared around the world. And we saw this not just in India, of course. We saw this in European cities, in North American cities, and Chinese cities. And when you consider that 21 of the 30 most polluted cities in the world are in India, cities like Bangalore and Chennai and others, this is significant. And what we saw in New Delhi, for example, was a decline of over 60% in nitrogen dioxide emissions, which is what comes from cars, and particulate matter in the city, which explains why people were suddenly able to see faraway mountains and blue pristine skies. And this was a phenomenon I think we saw around the world. We also saw this really acutely in China, where virtually all forms of air pollution came down, including and most specifically in Wuhan, which of course many people say is a source of this virus. But across China, even though 2/3 of the country went into lockdown, across the entire country, we saw NO2 levels and CO2 levels decline. The problem, though, is that while we've seen a pretty dramatic decline in carbon, in nitrogen dioxide, and in PM 2.5, in particulate matter, they're actually coming roaring back right now as lockdowns are being lifted. And so these improvements that people talk about, being able to see fish in the canals of Venice or the Himalayas from northern India, or boars in the streets of Barcelona, these were pretty ephemeral impacts. And I don't think we should confuse COVID-19 with a solution for climate change, because as Ian said, we are facing an enormous challenge, not least in some of the diplomatic efforts, including the Paris Agreement and other major climate agreements that are being disrupted by this pandemic, as people are distracted, and as many governments are inclined to go back to coal-burning, carbon-intensive energy solutions at a time of financial scarcity and austerity. So this is a big concern that we have, that we set out. But let me just talk briefly about an issue that might be close to home, which is the melting of the glaciers. Because most people, when we talk, and there's been a lot of news about this lately, right? About the Arctic experiencing fires, and about huge shelves calving off the Antarctic coast, or big glaciers disappearing off the Greenland. I think that the key here is that it's not just the Arctic and the Antarctic or Greenland. One of the biggest challenges we're facing right now on the climate change front that we describe in the book, and it's a place where Ian and I are deeply attached to and fond of, are the Himalayan glaciers. And we're seeing extraordinary melting happening. There's been major contractions over the last couple of decades. And this has regional and global implications, not just economic and environmental, but also security implications. I mean, if you think about the Himalayas, they stretch across about a 1,500-mile stretch across 5 countries that concentrates about 40% of the world's population and 20% of the world's freshwater reserves. It feeds major rivers like the Indus and the Ganges, I don't have to tell you, but also the Mekong and the Yangtze and the Yellow River. So we call the Himalayas the third pole after the Arctic and the Antarctic for good reason, because this is an incredibly important reservoir of water and a source of sustenance for a vast proportion of the world's population. But we've seen the Himalayas retreat by about a fifth since the 1970s. And we've seen a parallel increase in lakes and water reservoirs, as well as flash floods throughout the regions surrounding the Himalayas. And this is having enormous impact, especially in seismically unstable areas like Nepal, on populations who are living predominantly in rural or peri-urban areas. And so why is this happening? Why are the Himalayas melting? Well, one of the things we were able to see from space using maps is the extensive expansion of what we call black carbon, or soot, which is really generated from biomass, right? The burning of fuel, coal power plants, and of course the extraordinary rise of vehicular use across China and India over the last couple of decades. So as soot falls on the white glaciers, what happens is it absorbs more sun, we call that the albedo effect, and that accelerates the melt. And at the same time as the surface temperature rises, that weakens the underbelly of the glaciers, which increases water flow, which loosens them from the mountaintops. And so if trends continue as they appear to be trending, we could see at least a third of the glaciers disappear by the end of the century. Now, that's at a temperature change of about 1.5 degrees. Most climate scientists think that we've already blown that we're already headed to a 2-degree, maybe a 3-degree world in terms of temperature increase over the next decade or two. If that happens, we're talking about 2/3 of all glaciers disappearing. And if you consider that 40% of humanity is concentrated in this area, this has enormous implications for everything from the politics and relationships between countries, right down to food security of citizens in the most rural outreaches. So big challenges ahead, and we have to get serious about them.
Professor Goldwin, as Dr. Muggah is pointing out, this is one bounce back you don't want when you're talking about pollution and climate change. But what about inequality? You deal with that a lot as well. And as Dr. Muggah and you've been pointing out earlier in this discussion, the inequality of the pandemic being affecting people. Take us through a little bit of what you talk about in your book, especially some fascinating maps on how spatial maps of lighting show inequality.
Yeah, there are lots of different ways to think about inequality, and this pandemic is certainly increasing inequality, not least because people at high income levels can work at home and remotely. We can work at home or from offices, whereas essential workers and many others, people on construction sites, people in the fields, have to go to work. They don't have any option. And like many other aspects of risk, it's the poor people that suffer most. The same will happen from ocean rises in Mumbai and Dhaka and other places. And the same thing is happening with the pandemic. It's also that the hospital facilities are worse, the care's worse, and so everyone is impacted worse that's poorer. But at a bigger level, it's difficult sometimes to measure inequality, and we don't have statistics for many of the poorest places. There's also huge inequalities in government's attention, in data, in statistics, and it tends to be that poor people are less captured in the data sets. So one of the things we do, which we show in the book, is use lights and how many lights are in places to understand. And we have images, for example, of cities in Africa of about 15 million people like Lagos, and compare them to a place like New York with a similar population, and you see this huge striking difference in the luminosity of the two places, and we do that for others. And when you look at the satellite photographs of lights at night of the world, you see this amazingly lit up Europe, lit up USA, space in the deserts and at the Rocky Mountains, and then lit up parts of India, very high population density.
Eastern seaboard of China with lots of black holes,
exactly,
where the coast cities are probably.
Exactly, and then just massive, most of the world actually quite dark. Some of that's desert, some of that's Antarctic and Arctic and so on, but it's also reflects where there are people, the lack of energy, the lack of electricity. And when we think about climate change, for example, one of the biggest questions is how do we make sure people have access to energy without accelerating climate change? How do we get clean energy, sustainable energy, as well as those that already have it, transforming? Just New York State consumes more energy than the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. And that's what we can show with these maps.
Dr. Muggah, another interesting part of the book is where you dispel so-called myths. When you look at, say, refugees or migration and how that has been associated with terrorism, this is an interesting parallel of how you use mapping of that. And I think each of the dots that we'll be showing represent a huge amount of refugees and the places where they're coming from and going, and how terrorism is not necessarily related to that.
It's a really disturbing set of maps, actually. What we're able to do is take data from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which is the agency responsible for supporting, protecting, assisting people on the move as a result of political violence, and plot it over time to show just the sheer volume and scale of people who are forced to flee their circumstances. And so just looking at the map to get a sense of the overall monumental nature of it is somewhat breathtaking. And what we've done is we've also then plotted sort of political violence events, so-called terrorism events, as well as other forms of violence occurring in conflict, and tried to look at the relationships to see, how are one feeding the other. I think it's worth mentioning that there are more refugees and displaced people right now, today, than at any point since the Second World War. So what we're dealing with is a monumental challenge of over 26 million refugees, over 45 million people have been internally displaced. And we're also facing the looming disaster, and it was already alluded to, of the millions, hundreds of millions of climate displaced that will be coming in the coming decades as droughts occur and floods increase and extreme weather events become more prolific. We have, one thing that we see from the map, though, is that the vast majority of this displacement, this movement, which is different, by the way, than migration, which is a different set of phenomena, similar but different, is the vast majority of this refugee and displacement flows are in the southern hemisphere. So in sort of south of the United States, south of Europe, and south of sort of northern China to a large extent. And it's kind of worsening, which is disturbing. There was a period where displacement was declining, but in the last couple of years, and since COVID as well, it's been accelerating. And so this has been a really hot ticket issue in the West, or in the northern hemisphere, in the so-called global north. And it's been really divisive in the politics, as many of your listeners will know, throughout Europe, especially, but also in the United States, under the current president in particular, but not exclusive to Donald Trump. And a lot of it, this tension, this concern, has been about the fear of refugees and displaced people coming essentially and taking jobs, or of contributing to crime, or even committing terrorist events, which has contributed to populist politics across the region, including the idea of banning entire categories of populations based on their religion and the rest. What the maps show, though, is a different story, and what people who study this issue know suggests a very different narrative, which is that actually the vast majority of people who are on the move are staying within their country, first of all. They don't necessarily want to leave in many cases. They want to stay close to home. And when they are forced to move, tend to move next door. And the classic example of that is Syria. When Syria exploded in 2011, 2012, the vast majority of Syrians didn't go to Western Europe, although 1 million plus people did go to predominantly Germany and Sweden. They actually stayed in the neighboring countries like Lebanon and Turkey and elsewhere. Easily 4 to 5 million people stayed next door. And then there are millions more who were internally displaced. And yet that number, which was large in European standards but small in global standards, generated unprecedented ripple effects across Europe and North America, which shaped the politics for the next couple of years and continues to shape them even today. So I think what the maps show us is it gives us kind of a reality check about the true nature of the magnitude of how people move and the kind of burden that many countries are having to take on when they take on refugees next door, despite international law requiring a burden sharing or demanding or informing states that they must share the burden of this. So what happens is countries in Africa, countries in South Asia, countries in Southeast Asia tend to bear the disproportionate burden of refugees, despite being in many ways more resource scarce and lacking this kind of capabilities that countries in North and Western Europe might have. The second myth that I think is dispelled is this idea that somehow refugees and displaced people are agents of terrorism or extremist violence. And this is an old trope that's often raised, not exclusively, certainly in the global North. It happens in many cases where politicians throw this out there as a way of drumming up their base. And what we find is actually, for the most part, and for virtually all of the part, refugees and displaced people are fleeing violence. Because what we've done is we've taken individual events of terrorism from the Global Terrorism Database, as well as from a group called ACLED, plotted them out down to the lat long point. And what you see is the vast majority of people are leaving areas where there's violence. They're not contributing to it. Yeah. And I think it's important. I mean, what we show in the book is that the chance of a person being a victim of terrorism in the global North is about the same as being hit by lightning. Violent extremism and terrorism is hyper concentrated in a small number of countries like Syria and Afghanistan, Somalia, the Philippines, and Yemen. Very rare, very scary, but very rare events. And the chance of a refugee or displaced person contributing to an act of terrorism is statistically negligible. There have been virtually no incidents. And yet monumental policy positions are made based on this kind of spurious assumption. So the book seeks to try to explain that and dispel some of these myths that are proliferating.
There's so much that you could discuss, but Professor Goldwin, if I can get concluding remarks from you, and there's nothing more evocative than seeing the Earth from space, the blue marble as it's called. But I think in conclusion, you would also be, I beg your pardon, be looking at changing the world to something that's better than what it was pre-COVID, right?
Absolutely. When we look at the world, we see this incredible space, and we see the opportunities. We see how some people have done so well from global flows, and others have done so badly. And so we feel very passionately that there's huge opportunity, that we can create a world free of poverty, free of hunger, of shared prosperity. We need to understand, and we need to share common humanity. And one thing that COVID-19 has taught us is that we're all connected, that the threats can come from anywhere. It was China this time, it could be anywhere else next time. And unless we work together on climate change, on pandemics and other areas, we're heading for a very dangerous and less prosperous world. But if we work together, if we learn the lessons, we can do much better as individuals, as societies, and as a global community. So our hope and the purpose for the book is to provide some insights which will help all your listeners and everyone else that reads the book gain some signposts on what to do and how to do it to create a better world.
Dr. Muggah, your last comments on
sure.
looking so beautiful from space. It's so fragile there, but it's up to us. That's what you're trying to make, right? To take care of it. It's up to us to shape our destiny. That
map, that image of the blue marble, which is emblazoned in the minds of people of a particular generation. That image was taken in the early 1970s from space by a NASA astronaut. Had a really profound impact on global consciousness at the time. And it really, you could say, sparked, in many ways, the modern environmental movement that we currently have today. So a single image actually generated dramatic social transformation. And I think that's the point of the book. Data visualizations and maps help us make connections that were previously hard to discern, hard to detect. And I, as I said, since the very beginning, since the very first maps that we created, we did the same thing. For 10,000 years, human beings have been using maps to make the unknown known. Back in Roman times, cartographers marked maps in areas that were unexplained or unexplored with the Latin phrase, "Here be lions." In the Middle Ages, they marked them with dragons and serpents and gargoyles. These were literally uncharted waters. And the title of our book, Terra Incognita, is equally ancient. It can be traced back to 150 AD, to Ptolemy and his very famous book at the time, Geographia. The expression died out in the 19th century out of a kind of hubris, a sense that somehow we'd map the world. We didn't, But I think what's happening today is with satellites and supercomputers and AI and new digital means, we're able to see much more and understand it with a certain amount of humility how much more there is to learn. But what we're convinced by with this book, ultimately, and this is the sort of the take-home message, is that by revealing the geographies that really define us, by showing changes over time, we can give people a better sense of what's happening around them at a time of extreme confusion, but also hopefully a motivation to act, because ultimately the future is what we make it.
Well put, Dr. Robert Muggah. Thank you so much for your time from all the way from Canada.
Thank you.
And Professor Goldwin from the UK. So we've connected 3 continents here. Great to have you on the show. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Global. I'm Amitabh Brady, and do go on to our website to support our kind of journalism.